Poetry up here. This is an essay I wrote a number of years ago, and it deals with, well, a couple of things. It deals with the death of my uncle and the founding of my hometown and just a bunch of different things. And I don't think I'm going to have time to get through the whole thing tonight, but maybe I'll finish it next week. It's called Convergence. The water swept along its path, spurts and fumes forced by large gray stones as our Mountain Dew and Pepsi boats bounded down the irrigation ditch. Gripping a tree branch for balance, I cheered my captainless vessel, shouting for it to avoid the ditch's eddies and pools. Scott's and my boats bobbed as they poured towards their end. Running along the gravel roadside to the ditch, we hoped to beat our ships to the corrugated steel tunnel where they would disappear forever. Filled with creeping, crawling creatures, the tunnel promised death to an imaginative 12-year-old. And though, more often than not, we missed the bottles, fingers fumbling along their tops like an awkward lumberjack trying to balance on a log, the losses never seemed to dim our day. I've colored this memory in light. The freedom of youth stretched out in long brush strokes of bright blue and soft yellow. That summer of '92 is bound to that ditch in American Fork, Utah, that was somehow big enough to fill my world with imagination, like some unknown god holding out the promise of life and living. In 1850, it would have been more than a day's ride from the Salt Lake Valley, where the Chipman and Adams families were temporarily located, to their destination at Fort Provo. Breaking for the night, the group set up camp along the American Fork Creek under the cottonwoods that line its banks. 14-year-old William Henry Chapman, taken aback by the beauty of the area and the stilling sense of the creek, looked at his father Stephen and said, "I think I would like to live here." In honesty, I can't be sure that it was the creek's quiet words or the cool scent of cottonwoods and sagebrush that filled William Henry with a desire to live alongside the canyon stream. However, these are the things that have often filled me with a sense of contentment and instilled within me a love of the creek and the canyon it births from. I couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 when, driving through American Fork on a Sunday afternoon, my dad pointed out the little white house on 4th North. He explained that it was the home he had grown up in. He seemed happy thinking back upon his childhood in a house small enough to be an apartment. He didn't tell me at that time, when I was still a child, about his brother David and the horrible events that transpired there in 1952. Over a decade passed from the time he pointed out that house to the time I hesitantly asked him about his brother's death. It's not a happy memory. My father's voice commands attention and respect, and it has often filled me with anxiety when its tone hinted at some mistake of mine. However, I had never heard his voice take on this tone. Soft and cold, bruised in sadness, it filled me with fear and guilt. In the summer of 1851, with ground that seemed more likely to yield stone than any crop, the early settlers of American Fork set to the task of creating ditches. Washburn Chipman, John Cole, and Solomon Thomas joined efforts to be among the first to break through the hard, dry land in hopes of bringing much-needed water to the west side of American Fork. Maybe it was Cole who, out in the wilderness, uprooted the tree stumps and gathered the large rocks to make the makeshift dam. His horses would have strained in the desert heat as they pulled at the stumps of trees cut down to make the frontier cabins. Did they stop in the shade after the initial furrow broke ground, watching the water run from the dam, filling and softening the arid land? After the test run, they dug additional furrows, widening the ditch. The second and third furrows were a relief, coming easier now that the land was wet. As the sun made its way down, swallowed in the orange sky, Chipman, Cole, and Thomas sat along the dam, watching the water run in the vein they had created, water like blood, mixing in dirt, trying to bring life in the shadow of a desert. Years after Scott and I have lost touch, I walk along the little ditch that consumed us. Trees have grown and been cut back, and work on the road has cleaned up the loose gravel sides we ran along. The tunnel remains jagged and dark. It's cold. There are only traces of snow on the ground, but we're still in the heart of a Utah winter. Robert Michael Pyle wrote in his book, The Thunder Tree, "A ditch somewhere, or a creek, meadow, woodlot, or marsh, these are places of initiation, where the earth gets under our nails and a sense of place gets under our skin." Do I have a sense of place for this place? It seems our summer changed the ditch, transformed it into something bigger. Only a trickle now runs through the ditch. Most of its base is covered in a netting of moss and leaves, green and brown working together to hide the ditch's floor. What secret does it have to hide? Ambling down into the net of moss and leaves, Ambling down into the net of moss, I lean, elbows on knees, inspecting the thin hairs. Is my life like the network of moss? I want to say this ditch is a part of me, one of thousands of little green hairs covering the whole of who I am. But is its only real power in my remembering? The life of this ditch is much broader than that summer from my youth. Can I be selective with the tones I use when I paint this place in my mind? Is it wrong to leave out the darker shades? The little white house had a backyard about 30 feet deep with soft green grass. 30 feet is a continent to children. The yard ran parallel to the irrigation ditch in the neighboring yard. They were a young family. My grandfather worked at the steel mill while Grandma Edwards took care of the house and watched their 3 kids. I imagine my grandma in the kitchen, preparing a Sunday lunch of pot roast and potatoes, or perhaps still cleaning up from a breakfast, the smell of pancakes and bacon hanging heavy in the air. My dad, with the pointy ears he'd not yet grown into, and a gentle wave at the front of a head of dark hair, played in the backyard with Patsy and David. They romped in the fresh warmth that comes with a change of seasons, the transfer from April to May. Annie Dillard wrote in her book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, an infant who has learned to hold his head upright has a frank and forthright way of gazing about him in bewilderment. He hasn't the faintest clue where he is, and he aims to learn. David, 14 months old, still found himself filled with that infant bewilderment. While Dad and Patsy played, David explored. Through my imagination, and with the assistance of George F. Shelley's Early History of American Fork, I crawl inside the small log cabin of an American Fork family, where children sit under the dining table. There are no shops or factories in the early days of American Fork, and the table is made from rough materials found in the surrounding area. I use warm, earthy tones as I draw out this recreation. Older family members sit at stools made from logs left over after the building of the cabin. Dinner cooks on a baking skillet hanging over the fireplace. Humid, musty scent rolls off the skillet, filling the room, and the family with the smell that, through time, they have come to recognize as dinner. Fathers and boys wear buckskin moccasins made dark from days working in the dust of the desert. Humble handmade buckskin clothes are worn by the whole family, though only the men who work outside have the moccasins. The women and children go barefoot. Even with this new irrigation ditch, water has been scarce. A common-sized family for their day, the parents and 8 children wait for their meal of venison, sogos, and thistle roots. Several of the children are pale with long faces, sick from eating too much fish and wild game. But the land allows them no more. They strive not for balanced meals, rather ones that will stifle the effect of an empty stomach. Water has failed the small town that will never become a thriving community of farmers, but will instead flower with the flowing influence of industry, logging, mining, and milling. Oh man, Sitting at the back of my bedroom, suddenly feeling colder, I asked my father who the first person was to notice David's disappearance. I don't know, he says in a low, soft voice. I move cautiously down the list of questions, like pulling thorns, each one bookended with hesitation, then concern. Somewhere in the confines of Geneva still a phone rings. There is bad news, an accident at home. Back in American Fork, family and friends search the area surrounding the house. David can't have gone far, small as he is. They search the house, neighboring yards, out into the street, across the street. Then just before, or maybe just after my Grandpa Edwards arrives from work, someone notices the ditch. I can imagine the sudden, sweeping sense of horror that hit them once the fence and the ditch became apparent. Did they know then, even before they found David's body pinned to the grate, what had happened? American Fork's obituary page explains that both my grandfather and the American Fork Fire Department tried CPR before David was pronounced dead. I don't want to imagine my grandfather in the blue work coveralls I had always known him to wear, his dark tan skin streaked with sweat and tears, bent over the infant, refusing what the laws of nature insist. David was already gone. But I can't help it. This image develops despite my not wanting them to. T.S. Eliot said that humankind cannot bear very much reality, and this is where I'm at, leaning over my limit of reality. I want to turn now that I'm faced with the pain of that day. Suddenly I find myself filled with anger, not at God, not at anyone but myself. I hate the part of me that needed to know about that day, because now I don't want to know. Don't want to disturb the image of my grandfather I carry in my mind, the image of a strong, rough, and tested man, much like the pioneers who dug the ditches which bring and take life. Though, isn't this also a fitting memory of my grandfather, a man pulled to his knees by sorrow and love? I have returned to the ditch to walk its borders once again. There is more water today than before, and little patches of snow along its banks. A minnow splashing in the water catches me off guard as I head towards the tunnel. Another fish sachets to the water's surface as it passes the tunnel's entrance. There is life, wild and wiggling, that dares to enter the tunnel Scott and I were so sure held nothing but death. Slowly, with my left foot on the bank and balancing my right on a broken cinder block that sits 4 feet in front of the tunnel, I straddle half the ditch. Another fish swims between my legs into the tunnel, life into death. As I sketch out the canvas of my life, isn't it worth the pains of reality to render things accurately? Can a person or place be done justice if I only use those lighter shades?